Stick with us. Today, we're going to talk about my favorite subject. And my favorite subject just happens to be the rapture of the church. With us is a gentleman who has studied it beyond anything you can imagine, and his name is Dr. Thomas Ice, and everybody calls you Tommy.
Right. I've never grown up.
And the thing I've noticed about you is that you love to defend the rapture of the church. You love to take people into depths of study and understanding where they have not gone before.
Because that is our blessed hope.
It is.
It's a tremendous hope.
And so I'm going to turn you loose. There's a lot of argument today about the rapture, as there always has been. But for me, it's a certainty. It is my blessed hope. What can I say? But let's go from there.
Well, the rapture is not in Matthew 24, let me just say that, or Matthew 25. I know a recent book came out rebuking pre-tribulationism, and 2/3 of the book was dealing with arguments from Matthew 24 and 25, the Olivet Discourse. That was given like 3 days before Christ died. Mm-hmm. The night before he died is the Upper Room Discourse that's only recorded in John 13 through 16, and then the chapter 17 as well is part of that. And here everything, once Judas leaves the room, 2/3 of the way through chapter 13, everything that Christ mentions and talks about is brand new church age truth. And he's introducing them to church age truth, which is then expanded upon, especially by Paul, but others in the New Testament as it's written, in the epistles especially. And so when you realize that John 14:1-3 is where Christ introduces the rapture, that's the first mention. Mm-hmm. And so it is something new. It's not the second coming is mentioned frequently in the Old Testament. And it's expounded upon in Matthew 24 and 25. And so you then realize the first epistle that Paul wrote was Galatians, where he, at the Jerusalem Council, was defending the doctrine of justification by faith, which he expanded upon in the book of Romans in the middle of his writing career, so to speak. And then but the next two epistles were 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And we know that Paul spent, 17 years after he was converted before he wrote any of his epistles and things. And he talks about in 2 Corinthians about being taken up into heaven and I think he's talking about the rapture there. It was revealed to him by Christ in a heavenly vision there. And so he talks about it in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4.
Right.
Where he explains the doctrine of the rapture. And so we see that in 4:13 through 18, and the key part is starting in verse 15, is for this we say to you by the word of the Lord. Now, what does he mean by the word of the Lord? I thought the whole Bible is a word. It is, but he's saying that he received this direct revelation from God. In other words, not something that he received as the revelation of God indirectly from God, so to speak. But by the word of the Lord means he told me that, is what that phrase there means, I'm pretty sure. And so he says that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord. And by the way, there's a lot of different terms used to describe the rapture. It's not just one term or something like that. And the coming of the Lord shall not precede those who have fallen asleep. And of course, I've seen that in nurseries,
Yes.
About babies and everything. It says, for the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel and the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. And so he's talking about how in Christ means that they're part of the church age. So this is why we believe the rapture is only going to take church age believers from the day of first believers in Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 to the rapture. And I believe that all the rest of believers throughout history will be resurrected at the second coming, except for those in the millennium who will be resurrected at that point. So you have to have at least 3 corporate resurrections, in the Bible.
Okay. And having said that, I just want to interject.
Yes.
That for me, well, I said the rapture is my blessed hope, which it is. And I'm thinking of thousands of people out there right now, and they want to believe this same thing, but they really don't come from a background where this has been taught, or that it's been taught that this rapture thing is not going to happen until the far, far future, or it has complications that you don't understand. In other words, there are all sorts of belief systems out there that try to dilute the blessed hope and turn it into something else. But for me, it's still the blessed hope. I'm just looking for it. I mean, even as we're sitting here right now, I'm looking for it.
Well, I did a program with you showing that there have been, by and large, the rapture has not been taught in the church throughout history. And there's reasons for that. Roman Catholicism dominating. In fact, premillennialism in the late 5th century was declared to be a heresy in one of the creeds, Chiliasm as it was called. And so you go 1,100 years in church history where nobody claimed to be a premillennialist, because you would be considered. And so if premillennialism is not, which I think is even clearer, than pre-tribulationalism, then and some of the people started writing stuff later, during the Reformation era about premillennialism, and it actually, had a surge in the 1600s. Most Puritans were premillennial in the 1600s, and then postmillennialism comes in the 1700s, but that's beside the point. And so you have a person here and there all the way back to the 3rd century who taught some form of pre-tribulational rapture. And we did a program showing that we had 35 examples of people all the way from the 200s up to before Darby in 1830 who taught some form of pre-tribulationalism. So we're starting to discover that, because in the past, academics had not been interested in disclosing those kinds of things. But so now we're seeing that the rapture is taught and believed by almost all fundamentalists, especially up through around 1980, people who took the Bible literally. And there's been a decline among the lay people, especially, who believe in the pre-trib rapture. But almost all people who teach verse by verse through the Bible are pre-tribulational. They believe in the rapture, because you have to, if you're just doing topical stuff, you can do anything.
Yeah.
But if you're having to coordinate it, I know you have a lifetime as a verse-by-verse Bible teacher.
Absolutely. Expository Bible teaching.
Exactly.
Lewis Sperry Chafer, the systematic theology,
That's right. Which, by the way, that didn't really come on into the church until the early 1800s through some Irishmen. There's a whole story there. But nevertheless, it became the meat and potatoes of conservative Christianity, especially from about 1900 on. And so that's why there were so many people who are pre-trib, because you have to coordinate the whole scriptures, you see. And so Christ introduces the rapture, and it's one of the first things Paul expands upon as the apostle to the Gentiles. He says, then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds. That's the Greek word harpazo. And I didn't invent the term rapture. That was something that in Europe, when you had all the scholars that would come together, and they all spoke Latin from different languages. And so that is the Latin word for that term, caught up, harpazo in Greek. And so that's how, and you can look at commentaries, no matter if they're liberal, conservative, pre-trib, post-trib, whatever, they all use the word rapture in the scholarly world because it was a Latin term, and they had that in common. That's where the popular usage of the term rapture has come from. And so people say, the rapture's not in the Bible. Well, yes, it is. Here it is. Caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. Thus shall we always be with the Lord. Therefore, comfort one another with these words. So here he introduces in a clear way the rapture. In fact, every chapter in 1 Thessalonians talks about the rapture or mentions it. Now, when you go to 2 Thessalonians, which was written 6 to 9 months afterwards, apparently there had been a false epistle being circulated that they were already in the tribulation. And you see this in chapter 2, verse 1. He says, now we request you, brethren, with regard to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him. By the way, because of what's called the Granville-Sharp rule of grammar, which means that in that construction in the Greek, both terms, the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering have to refer to the same event.
Okay.
So whatever he's talking about, our gathering together with him, and that's the Greek word epi-synagoge. Synagogue is a gathering.
Right.
And with the word epi, it intensifies it, our gathering together to him. And so here he's introducing the topic of, I'm going to talk about the rapture, what we call the rapture popularly today. And he says, that you may not be quickly shaken from your composure or be disturbed either by a spirit or a message or a letter as if from us, so a pseudo letter there, to the effect that the day of the Lord had come. Now the term day of the Lord is one of the 22 terms, I did a chapter in a book once on that, of the terms that describe what we know as the tribulation. The day of the Lord is broader than the tribulation, but it includes that. It's the most common term. So he's talking about that they're in the tribulation in essence. And he says, let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come unless, and my New American Standard says the apostasy comes first. Well, the word apostasy is the word apostasy in the Greek. In fact, they created that English word in the 1600s.
Well, an apostate is a sort of a hated individual. It's someone who has bolted away from sound doctrine and started something of his own, and he's a bad guy, an apostate.
And the New Testament talks about it, but in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, there's not a word of him correcting apostate teaching or anything like that. In fact, the 7 major passages warning against apostasy all come in the later epistles. 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and there's some in Jude and those kind of epistles. So he's saying that the word best is translated departure. And that's what, interestingly enough, if you look back at translation traditions, we see that Jerome, who did the Vulgate, translated it departure. Now, a departure can either be used abstractly, which would mean apostasy, to depart from the faith, or physical. But if the key core meaning of the word is departure, then the best translation is departure, and let the context dictate what it's referring to. In fact, in Acts 21:21, it clearly refers to what we call apostasy, where he says that Paul was teaching them to depart from the Mosaic law. But even there, you can translate it depart, and it's understood, but it has a qualifying phrase, from the Mosaic law, so that's very clear. And that's the only other time the noun is used. But back to the translation traditions, you have him translating it departure, and then you have Wycliffe, in the oldest of English translations, translated it departing. You have Wycliffe Purvey Bible translated it departure. And you have Tyndale in 1526 translated it departure. And you have Coverdale, 1535, translated at departure. You have the Cranmer Bible, 1539, translated at departure. You had the Great Bible, 1540, translated at departure. And you had the earlier editions of the Geneva Bible, translating it departing, starting in 1559, actually.
Yeah, in fact, I've got a 1560 facsimile copy of the Geneva Bible, which I Xeroxed, and it says, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a departing first."
Yes.
That's what it exactly says. 1560.
So, and Paul's emphasizing first. In other words, the first thing that's got to happen is the departure.
A departing first. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. And then the Breaches Bible in 1576 translated departing. And then you had the Rheims Bible in 1582. Do you know what the Rheims Bible was?
You're going to tell me.
Yeah, it was the first Catholic translation. And so they translated it revolt. Why? Because they wanted it to refer to the Protestants who had revolted against Mother Church. And so they went with a theological interpretation rather than a translation. You follow?
Mm-hmm. I do.
And they started kind of the battle. But then you had the Beza Bible, Theodore Beza, the great reformer,
Right.
1583, departing, and the Geneva Bible in 1608, a later edition, also stuck with departing. And by the way, the Geneva Bible was the Bible the Puritans used.
I remember.
And
Yeah.
they hated the King James. You know why? Because it was viewed as a Catholic Bible because there were Anglicans made up a third of the translation committee.
And about that time, 1611, there were very large rifts
Yes.
among theologians, and there was a Catholic, basically a Catholic insurgence at that time.
And King James hated the Puritans and the Protestants and stuff, even though he was supposed to be one. But we could say some other things about him, but I'm not going to.
So we've got here the old phrase, "a battle for the Bible."
Yes, translations. And so the King James was the first Protestant translation that kind of volleyed back against the Catholic Bible with the word apostasy. So what is that? That's where they created a word. It's like baptism. That was a big controversy back then as well. And so instead of translating the word baptism to mean immerse,
Yeah.
which is the translation, they created an English word, baptism, which is from the Greek word baptizo. That way they didn't have to translate it, you see. They did the same thing here with the King James. They created that word in English, apostasy, from
make a point.
the Greek word. Yes.
To make a point. That's exactly what
A
was.
theological point rather than a lexical study of what the word actually means, which everyone says it means departure. Well, and not only that, you have here the article is used, the departure. So all nouns are definite, even without an article. But when you put an article, that means you're referring to a specific person, a place, or a thing, a specific event. And that's created tremendous interpretive problems for people down through the years.
And I'm looking here at my good old King James, and it says a falling away first. It doesn't say the falling away.
I know. They took liberties with the grammar there.
So the Greek word for the is actually there.
Yes. And there's no object. Departure from the Mosaic Law, for example. It just says the departure, which meant Paul knew what it meant.
Right.
And they knew what it meant. And so it was apparently something so obvious that he doesn't give a qualifying phrase like from the Mosaic Law.
Now, I'm thinking on behalf of our viewing group with us today, and I'm thinking, I know you really want to have a certainty in your mind about the coming of Christ for the church, and you want to be comforted. And by the way, I want to be comforted. We all do. And I think that's the reason we're doing this study, because there is great comfort in knowing that he's going to come for us. And he's going to come for us before a bunch of really bad stuff begins to happen.
Right, even though bad stuff is happening today.
Even though it's happening today.
Yeah, what we would, as Americans, consider bad stuff.
Right,
exactly. Yeah. And so he's saying, he then goes on, and there's nothing in the entire 1st or 2nd Thessalonians about apostasy, about departure from the faith or anything like that. And then he says, for it will not come unless the apostasy, I think the departure, comes first. And so he's saying you're not in the day of the Lord, the tribulation, because that departure has to happen first, the rapture. And then he goes on and says, and the man of lawlessness is revealed. In other words, you're not in the tribulation, you're not in the day of the Lord, because the Antichrist hasn't been revealed. And the son of destruction. And he goes on and talks about, look at verse 5, do you not remember that while I was with you, I was telling you these things?
Right.
And as a pastor, Gary, I know you know, you have to tell things over and over and over again.
You do.
You do.
And because I think it's not common for most people to build systematic theology in their head. That is to say, people want to be reassured. They want to be, they want to have their faith built up. But to understand a complex pattern or a structure, you have to study for a while, and you have to link between several different places. And a lot of people just don't do that.
Right. That's called abstract thinking. Well,
yes,
and I read an article years ago saying that only like 9% of the world thinks abstractly. And abstract thinking is something that is a quality that you need to be a good Bible teacher.
And if anybody was ever an abstract thinker, it was Paul.
Yes, exactly.
Wow.
He certainly was.
The man was beyond genius as far as I'm concerned.
He could connect things. And that's why it's more difficult for some people, and it requires more repetition to get things down.
But it's worth it.
It's worth it at the end. But he goes on and says that, and you know what restrains him, referring back to the Antichrist, now so that his time, in his time, he may be revealed. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work, only he who now restrains will do so until he's taken out of the way. And almost all I've not met a pre-tribulationist that doesn't think verse 7 is a reference to the rapture, you see. Well, see, this fits a parallelism in the text. I don't want to get into it, where he starts about the rapture. Then he has two phrases about the tribulation, and he returns to the rapture here at the end of verse 7. And we call, that's called an inclusio in some people's literary nomenclature. And so he's talking about the rapture again, and he first started talking about it, I believe, back in verse 3 with the apostasy. So you have that flow of the text that reinforces that idea. And then we see in verse 15, he says, so then, brethren, stand firm and hold to the traditions which you were taught, whether by word of mouth or by letter from us. And so he's addressing what he started the section with, about how they were receiving false teaching,
right?
And those kinds of things. And so when you look thoroughly at this text, there's nothing about the part. He's talking about the man of sin, but that's because he's describing the tribulation and telling them why they're not in the tribulation. Because you're not in the tribulation because the Antichrist hasn't come yet.
Now, this is an intimate group. These were Paul's close friends. And he spent time with them. They loved each other. They had a great relationship.
Wasn't that the town he was lowered to in a basket from? In a basket?
But it's amazing to me that in the midst of all this relationship, or the relational quality of Paul with his converts, there was this kind of familial approach. Hey kids, now, don't forget this. You can't. You remember when I told you these things? There's a closeness there.
I believe, as many people have said, if this is teaching about the rapture, this is a slam dunk verse. I've had people tell me, I'll give you $5,000 if you can show me one passage that teaches the rapture. Of course, they're the judge, and they never will accept it.
Right.
When you show them passages that teach the rapture. But this is a passage, if properly understood, I think clearly teaches that the departure here is the rapture, not apostasy. Apostasy is covered in those later epistles.
All of this, it just fills me with an amazing desire to see the gospel go out there.
Yes.
We got a little while left here. We don't know how long, but there are millions of people right now that really need to hear this sort of thing.
Well, and we've had an explosion in the last 150 years of the gospel going to places it's never gone before. Perhaps part of the Gulf War was to bring the gospel into certain Islamic areas. I don't know. But it had an impact. And some of the fastest growing areas of Christianity are Islamic areas where people are going in and preaching the gospel.
Well, you want to join in the study? I've got something here, Charting the Bible Chronologically. Ed Heinzen, Dr. Thomas Ice. And this thing is thorough. You want charts? This is wonderfully laid out. And we're offering this to you in what we're calling the Rapture Conspiracy package. There's a conspiracy to kind of erase the idea of the rapture. We have this book. And by the way, the Tim LaHaye Prophecy Bible. Bob Ulbrich loves his Tim LaHaye Prophecy Bible. You could not rip that away from him for anything.
And that thoroughly teaches the view we just explained in that
It really
study Bible.
does.
Yes.
And we have some free bonuses. The Falling Away, Dr. Andy Woods, Defending the Rapture, which Tommy Ice and myself did some years ago. The Mystery of the Rapture, another one. You and I have had these conversations before, but you can never have too many of them.
That's right.
Because we need to plant this idea thoroughly. It's the Rapture Conspiracy package. All this for your gift of $100, shipping included, absolutely free, anywhere in the United States. Check out prophecywatchers.tv and click on the library. Scroll down and you'll find the Rapture Conspiracy package. And I do hope that you avail yourself of all of the knowledge that's in this package because, and by the way, you and I are going to continue this discussion on another program. So hang in there and stay with us. We're talking about the blessed hope, and it's a wonderful thing. Absolutely wonderful.
I can't wait.
All right. I'm Gary Stearman. Hey, you keep watching. We are. Thanks for joining us on Prophecy Watchers. You can find us on the web at prophecywatchers.com.